Hey guys, tonight we are sneaking past the stern-faced Janissary guards and slipping into the velvet shadows of the Topkapi Palace. We in 17th century Istanbul, the heart of the Ottoman Empire, and we about to witness something so incredibly slow and meticulous that it makes a modern espresso machine look like a frantic, caffeinated squirrel. We here for the coffee ritual, specifically the legendary, agonizingly slow pour. Now, a fair warning. If you were actually a servant here and you accidentally clinked a spoon or let a stray drop of dark liquid hit the Sultan's silk robe, you probably wouldn't survive the night. They had very creative ways of making people disappear in the Bosphorus for much smaller offenses. So, let's keep our footsteps light and our breathing shallow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know who is awake with me in this quiet hour. Drop a comment below and tell me which city you in and what time it is right now. Is it 2 a.m. in London? Or are you catching this in the pre-dawn hush of Tokyo? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the cool, patterned marble of the third court. The air here is different from the salt, heavy breeze of the Golden Horn outside. Here, inside the palace walls, the air is thick with the scent of burning sandalwood, expensive musk, and a deep, earthy aroma that is slowly drawing you toward the Sultan's private quarters. You are following the smell of the bean in the 1600s. The Topkapi Palace was the absolute center of the world, a labyrinth of white stone and blue Iznik tiles where thousands lived, but only a few dozen were ever allowed to touch the Sultan's coffee. As you move through the corridors, your eyes adjust to the flickering glow of oil lamps. You pass by a room where a man sits with a dignity that suggests he is a high-ranking general. But he is actually the kafisiba, the chief coffee maker. In the mainstream history of the Ottoman court, this was just a kitchen job. It was one of the most powerful positions in the empire. The chief coffee maker was a trusted confidant of the Sultan, often involved in state secrets and political whispers. Simply because he was one of the few people allowed to stand close to the sovereign's head while he was vulnerable. Drinking. You follow the kafisibati as he prepares for the nightly service. He moves with a deliberate, haunting slowness. Every gesture is a choreographed dance. If you used to grabbing a paper cup and running for the subway, this will feel like a glitch in time. To the Ottomans, speed was for the commoners and the impatient. The more powerful you were, the slower the world moved around you. You watch as he selects a small, long, handled copper pot known as a SThe. It's been hand-hammered, its surface catching the dim light. Here is a quirky, slightly weird fact for you. The Sultan's coffee wasn't just about the caffeine. It was a logistical nightmare. For a single cup of coffee to reach the Sultan's lips, a procession of 40, yes, 40, servants was often involved. You had the tray bearers, the water pourers, the napkin holders, and the lookouts. It was essentially a military operation designed to deliver a few ounces of liquid. Imagine having a 40-man entourage just to go to the kitchen for a midnight snack. It's the ultimate flex of imperial luxury. But as you stand in the shadows of the palace kitchen, you notice a low-voiced argument between two scribes in the corner. They are debating the very origins of the drink that has become the empire's obsession. This brings us to a point that academic historians are still debating exactly how and when coffee first arrived in the Sultan's court. The mainstream story is that the governor of Yemen brought the beans back to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the early 16th century. However, some scholars argue it was actually two Syrian merchants from Aleppo and Damascus who opened the first coffee houses in Istanbul in 1554, and only after the drink became a public sensation did the palace decide to adopt and royalize it. The debate is essentially, did the Sultan lead the fashion, or was he just the last to know? You watch the Kafasiba place the copper pot onto a bed of glowing embers and hot white ash. He doesn't use a direct flame. That would be too aggressive, too modern. He wants the heat to seep into the water, as if it's a secret being whispered. You see the tiny bubbles beginning to form, and the smell, intense, dark, and slightly floral, begins to fill the room. It's so potent, it feels like it's coating your lungs. You realize that this entire process is designed to induce a state of keyf, a uniquely Turkish word that describes a state of quiet, blissful relaxation and mindful pleasure. As you watch the chief coffee maker wait for the foam to rise, you feel your own heartbeat slowing down. The palace is silent. The guards are statues, and the only thing that matters in the entire world is the slow, steady creep of heat through a copper pot. You re-standing on the edge of a ritual that has remained unchanged for centuries. The Sultan is waiting in the chamber beyond, sitting on cushions of heavy brocade, expecting a cup that is perfect in its temperature and its presentation. But before that cup can be served, it has to be poured. And that pour, my friend, is where the true test begins. You see the chief coffee maker lift the sieve from the ashes. His hand is steady as a rock. He approaches the small porcelain cup, which is cradled in a jeweled metal holder. He tilts his wrist just a fraction of an inch. You hold your breath. Nothing happens for a second, and then, finally, a single, dark, viscous drop of coffee begins to form at the lip of the copper pot. It hangs there, defying gravity, reflecting the flickering lamps of the kitchen. This is the beginning of the end of the journey for the bean, and the beginning of tonight's deep dive into the slow-motion heart of an empire. You realize that in this palace, time isn't measured by clocks. It's measured by the height of the foam and the steady, unbroken stream of the pour. As that first drop falls, you feel yourself being pulled deeper into the history, the scent, and the velvet silence of the Ottoman night. You are still standing there, leaning against a cold marble pillar, watching the Kafatiba, the chief coffee maker, move through the dimly lit preparation chamber. It's hard to wrap your head around the fact that this man, who is currently obsessing over the precise temperature of a handful of beans, is technically one of the most powerful people in the entire Ottoman Empire. In your world, a barista is someone you might exchange a few pleasantries with before they misspell your name on a paper cup. But here, if you were to disrespect the Kafasiba, you would just be getting decaf. You might be getting a one-way ticket to the bottom of the Bosphorus. Take a good look at him. He wears a robe of heavy dark silk, and he has a set of silver keys hanging from a belt that jingles softly with every measured step. He doesn't look like a cook. He looks like a high-ranking judge or a silent assassin. And in a way, he's a bit of both. The mainstream historical fact you should know is that the office of the Kafasiba was established in the mid-16th century, and it was no mere kitchen gig. It was an official court rank, listed alongside the Sultan's most trusted advisors. This man has his own staff of over 50 people. He has a budget that would make a modern Michelin-starred restaurant look like a lemonade stand. Why? Because coffee wasn't just a beverage. It was a political tool, a social lubricant, and a high-stakes ritual of trust. Think about it from the Sultan's perspective. You are the ruler of 3 continents. Everyone wants something from you, and quite a few people probably want you dead. You can just go to a public coffee house and grab a brew. You need someone who is so loyal, so vetted, and so elite that you can trust them to stand behind you with a boiling hot liquid and a cup that could easily hide a drop of arsenic. The Kafasiba is that man. He is the ultimate gatekeeper. He sees the Sultan in his most private moments. When he's sleepy, when he's stressed, or when he is plotting the next siege. Now, here is a quirky, slightly bizarre fact that might make you reconsider your own career path. The coffee to vizier pipeline In the Ottoman court, being the kafasiba was often a stepping stone to becoming a grand vizier, the equivalent of a prime minister. History is full of examples where the man who once stirred the Sultan's coffee ended up commanding the imperial armies, or governing vast provinces like Egypt or Hungary. The ultimate started from the bottom. Now we rehear story, except the bottom involved serving the world's most expensive caffeine. Imagine your local barista becoming the Secretary of State just because they made a really mean latte. It sounds ridiculous, but in the Topkapi Palace, if you could master the diplomacy of the coffee tray, you could master the world. As you watch him, you notice the way he interacts with the other servants. There's a tension in the room, a silent vibration of power. This brings us to a point where academic historians are still locked in a heated debate. Was the kafasiba actually a spy? Some scholars argue that the chief coffee maker acted as the Sultan's personal intelligence officer, because he was present during informal meetings and private audiences. He overheard everything: the whispers of viziers, the complaints of ambassadors, the gossip of the harem. Others argue that this is a bit of a romanticized legend, and that his role was strictly ceremonial and protective. But standing here, watching the way he glances toward the Sultan's closed doors, you can't help but feel that those ears are doing just as much work as his hands. He moves toward a large, silver-bound chest. He unlocks it with one of those jingling keys, and the scent of raw, unroasted beans hits you like a soft, earthy cloud. He isn't just grabbing a scoop of whatever is on sale. He is selecting individual beans with the care of a jeweler picking out diamonds for an engagement ring. He holds a bean up to the lamp, checking its color and its integrity. You realize that the slow part of this process didn't start with the pouring. It started hours ago with the selection. In this room, urgency is a sin. If he rushes, he fails. If the Sultan detects even a hint of bitterness or a lack of foam, it's not just a bad review on Yelp. It's a personal insult to the dynasty. The kafasiba's entire existence is dedicated to the elimination of friction. He is the man who makes sure the Sultan's day runs on a smooth, caffeinated rail. You watch him gesture to a younger apprentice. The apprentice approaches with a basin of water, moving so quietly he might as well be a ghost. Even the way they communicate is hushed. There's no shouting of orders. No, I need a double shot on the fly. It's all done with subtle nods and hand signals. It's a culture of silence. In the Ottoman court, the more important the task, the less you talk about it. You find yourself shifting your weight, and the sound of your own breathing feels embarrassingly loud in this space. The chief coffee maker begins to weigh the beans on a small, delicate scale made of brass. He is not using modern grams. He's using the Ottoman dirham. Every single grain counts. You realize that this is a world where precision is a form of worship. By being this careful, he is showing the Sultan and the world that the ruler of the Ottomans is worth this level of obsession. The snarky part of your brain wants to ask if it really matters. If there are 3 extra beans in the pot, but then you see the look on the kafasiba's face. He is in a trance. This is his art, his politics, and his survival all wrapped into one. He knows that a perfectly prepared cup can soothe the Sultan's rage or give him the clarity to sign a peace treaty. On the other hand, a lukewarm cup served with a shaky hand could be seen as a sign of weakness in the palace hierarchy, an opening for a rival to move in. You realize that you are not just looking at a kitchen, you are looking at a cockpit. This is where the energy of the empire is managed. As he prepares to roast the beans in a shallow, long-handled pan over the dying embers, you see the flickering orange light reflect in his eyes. He is the master of the flame and the bean, the man who holds the Sultan's morning in his hands. The slowness of it all is starting to seep into your bones. You feel the urge to check your phone, but you realize you don't even know where it is. In this room, the only clock is the steady, rhythmic movement of the Cafesiba, silver keys, and the slow rise of the sun over the Hagia Sophia outside. You are learning that power doesn't scream, it whispers. And in the Ottoman court, it smells like the darkest, richest coffee you've ever imagined. He begins to stir the beans in the pan. The sound, a dry, rhythmic shick, 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 is hypnotic. It's the sound of the ritual beginning in earnest. You realize that you've only just started to understand the layers of this world. You're not just here for a drink. You're here for a performance where the stakes are life, death, and the perfect crema. You reach out almost as if you're moving through water, and let your fingers brush against the cool, smooth surface of the wooden chest the chief coffee maker just opened. Your fingertips tingle as they dip into a sea of small, greenish gold pebbles. These aren't the dark, oily beans you see in modern glass jars at your local cafe. These are green beans, raw, unroasted, and carrying the dust of a journey that spanned thousands of miles and several months. They feel like little pieces of river stone, hard and ancient. But if you lean in and take a deep, slow breath, you can catch the faint, ghost-like scent of a distant world. It's a mix of sun-baked earth, sea salt, and a strange, spicy sweetness that tells you these beans have seen more of the world than most people in the 17th century ever would. These are the legendary beans of mocha. Now, I know what you're rethinking. You're rethinking of a sugary, chocolate-flavored latte with a mountain of whipped cream. But in the 1600s, mocha wasn't a flavor. It was a high-security fortress of a port in Yemen on the edge of the Red Sea. This was the Silicon Valley of the coffee world, the absolute epicenter of a global monopoly. The mainstream history of this era tells us that for over 100 years, almost every single coffee bean consumed in the world passed through this tiny, sun-scorched port. The Ottomans controlled it with an iron fist, making sure that coffee was the empire's most profitable and guarded secret. You watch the Cafesiba run a handful of the beans through his fingers, listening to the soft, rhythmic clink, clink, clink as they fall back into the chest. He treats them with more reverence than he would a bag of gold coins. And he should. By the time these beans reached the Topkapi Palace, their price had been inflated by taxes, bribes, pirate protection fees, and the sheer cost of camel transport across the Arabian Peninsula. To the Sultan, these weren't just beans, they were distilled power, a liquid representation of his reach from the gates of Vienna to the tip of the Arabian Shield. Here is a quirky, slightly corporate espionage fact for you. The Ottomans were the world's first aggressive patent lawyers. When it came to coffee, they were so terrified of someone else growing their own coffee trees that they had a very specific, very strict rule at the port of Mocha. No bean was allowed to leave the port unless it had been boiled or partially roasted. Why? Because boiling the bean kills the germ inside, making it impossible to plant and grow a new tree. They wanted to make sure that if you wanted coffee, you had to buy it from them. It was the 17th century version of digital rights management, DRM, but with boiling water and desert guards. If you were caught trying to smuggle a fertile bean out of the country, the consequences were, let's just say, much worse than a cease and desist letter. As you stand there in the flickering light, you see a young scribe in the corner of the kitchen, frantically taking notes on the inventory. This brings us to a point of academic controversy that still keeps historians arguing over their own morning brews. Most of us are taught the mainstream goat legend. The story of Kaldi, the Ethiopian goatherd who noticed his goats getting frisky after eating red berries. But scholars are actually deeply divided over whether coffee truly originated as a beverage in Ethiopia or Yemen. Some argue that while the plant is native to Ethiopia, the art of roasting and brewing, it was a Yemeni Sufi invention used by monks to stay awake during late-night chanting and prayer. There is a heated debate over whether the Ottomans discovered coffee or if they simply stole a mystical religious tool and turned it into a courtly luxury. Was it a holy medicine or a savvy trade commodity? Academic historians are still debating this, often siding with whichever region, archives SThe spent the most time in. You pick up a single bean and hold it up to the oil lamp. It's tiny, almost delicate. You imagine its journey, picked by hand in the misty terraced mountains of Yemen, loaded onto a creaking wooden dhow in Mocha, sailed up the Red Sea against the treacherous winds, and then hauled by camel caravan across the scorching sands of Egypt and the Levant before finally crossing the Marmara Sea to Istanbul. Every bean in this chest is a survivor. It has survived heat, damp, salt air, and the constant threat of Bedouin raiders. When you consider that, the slow pace of the palace ritual starts to make sense. You don't rush something that took a year to get to your table. You honor the journey. The chief coffee maker takes a small portion of the beans and places them into a shallow iron pan with a very long handle. He moves toward the charcoal stove. This is the moment of transformation. He begins to roast them, not in a massive industrial drum, but by hand over the gentle, glowing heart of the fire. The sound changes. The beans start to pop and crackle. A sound the Turks call the song of the bean. The color shifts from that pale, rocky green to a warm cinnamon brown, and then to a deep, dark mahogany. As the smoke begins to rise, it carries the first aroma. This isn't the smell of the coffee you're used to. It is more raw, more toasted, like the smell of a forest fire mixed with dark chocolate. You find yourself leaning in, your eyes closing involuntarily as the scent wraps around you. In the palace, this roasting was often done just moments before the coffee was served to ensure the sultan got the soul of the bean while it was still active. You notice the kafasibai checking the color of the beans by the light of a single candle. He's looking for the monk's habit, brown, a specific shade that indicates the perfect balance between sweetness and bitterness. If he goes 5 seconds too long, the coffee will be burnt and angry. If he stops too soon, it will be thin and cowardly. You realize that he isn't just cooking. He is navigating. He's using his nose and his eyes to guide these Yemeni travelers through the final, most dangerous part of their journey, the fire. The room is getting warmer, the air thicker. You can feel the grease from the roasting beans beginning to coat the walls and the silver trays. Everything in this kitchen is seasoned by centuries of this ritual. You realize that you not just in a palace, you in a temple of scent. The beans are finally ready. They are glowing, slightly oily, and pulsing with a heat that they've borrowed from the Arabian sun and the Ottoman coals. The chief coffee maker pours the hot beans onto a cooling tray made of woven hair. They hiss softly, a final sigh of relief. The journey from Mocha is almost over, but before they can be poured into the Sultan's cup, they have to be broken. They have to be turned into dust so fine that it feels like silk between your fingers. You look at the heavy, golden-hued mortar and the pestle waiting in the corner, and you realize that the real patience is about to begin. The beans have survived the sea and the desert. Now, they have to survive the rhythm of the stone.
You watch the apprentice pick up the golden-hued mortar, its brass surface polished so brightly it reflects the orange glow of the embers like a distorted mirror. The roasted beans are cool now, having rested on their tray of woven hair, and the air in the kitchen is heavy with the scent of toasted nuts and dark, sun-baked earth. The apprentice doesn't just dump the beans in, he places them one handful at a time, as if he's depositing treasure into a vault. There's a specific weight to this moment. In your world, if you want coffee, you press a button and a machine screams at you for 15 seconds until it spits out something vaguely hot. But here, the scream of the bean is replaced by a rhythmic, metallic lullaby. The apprentice begins to grind. Tink, tink, thump. Tink, tink, thump. He isn't just smashing the beans, he's coaxing them into a new state of being. He uses a heavy brass pestle, and the sound is surprisingly musical. In the silence of the palace night, this rhythm is the only thing moving. If you were a guard standing outside the kitchen door, this sound would be your clock. You'd know exactly how far along the Sultan's coffee was by the pitch of the mortar. As the beans break down, the sound shifts from a sharp, hollow tink to a muffled, deep thump. The goal here isn't just ground coffee. To an Ottoman, the medium-coarse setting on your fancy electric grinder would be considered an insult, a lazy man's shortcut. They need the coffee to be ground into a powder so fine that it feels like silk or expensive face powder between your fingers. It has to be dust. Why? Because Ottoman coffee is never filtered. There are no paper filters, no French presses, no metal meshes. The coffee and the water become one, a thick, dark emulsion where the dust must be so light that it stays suspended in the foam before slowly, gracefully settling to the bottom of the cup. If the grind is too thick, the Sultan gets a mouthful of sand, and the Kavasibasi gets a very difficult conversation with the royal executioner. Now, for a mainstream history point that usually gets lost in the steam, the role of the Sufi orders. While the palace turned coffee into a luxury, it was the Sufi mystics, the whirling dervishes, who truly mastered the spirit of the grind. They believed that the repetitive, rhythmic act of grinding the beans was a form of dhikr, a meditative remembrance of the divine. The sound of the mortar wasn't just kitchen noise, it was a heartbeat. They used the caffeine to fuel their late-night ceremonies, staying awake for hours in a state of spiritual intoxication. By the time coffee reached the Sultan's kitchen, it brought with it this aura of sacred focus. You aren't just making a drink, you're preparing a mystical potion. You lean in closer, watching the apprentice stop to check the texture. He takes a pinch of the dark powder and rubs it between his thumb and forefinger. He shakes his head, not fine enough yet. He goes back to the rhythm. Tink, tink, thump. You realize that his forearms must be like cords of steel. He does this every night, for hours. It's a workout that would make a modern gym-goer weep. Here is a quirky, slightly bizarre fact for you. Coffee was so central to palace life that it even made its way into the education of the harem. The women of the Sultan's harem weren't just living in luxury, they were highly trained in etiquette, music, and, most importantly, the art of the coffee service. A woman's social standing in the palace could be determined by how well she could grind the bean and how high she could make the foam rise. There were even coffee examinations, where a mistake in the grind could lead to a loss of status. Imagine failing your Coffee 101 final and being moved to a less prestigious wing of the palace. It's the ultimate high-stakes finishing school. As you watch the dust pile up in the bottom of the brass mortar, you notice a small bowl of green cardamom pods and cinnamon sticks nearby. This brings us to a point of academic controversy that keeps food historians bickering over their spice racks. Academic historians are still debating the great spicing controversy. Did the original Ottoman courtly coffee always include spices, or was that a later addition from the Arab world? Some scholars argue that the pure bean was the only way the Sultan would have it, seeing spices as a way to hide low-quality beans. Others point to ancient recipes that insist on a pinch of ambergris or musk to make the coffee fit for a caliph. The debate is essentially, was the Sultan a purist or a maximalist? Looking at the opulence of this kitchen, it's hard to imagine them saying no to a little extra luxury. The apprentice finally finishes. He carefully scoops the dark, fragrant dust into a small silk bag. The scent now is overwhelming. It's no longer just roasted, it's opened. It smells like the very essence of the earth, concentrated into a few ounces of brown powder. He hands the silk bag to the Kavasibasi, who inspects it with the gravity of a general inspecting his troops. He takes a small silver spoon and measures out the powder. He doesn't just toss it into the water, he lets it fall slowly, a dark snowfall landing on the surface of the cold, clear spring water already in the SThe. It doesn't sink. It's so fine that it floats, creating a dry, dark crust on top of the water. You realize that you are witnessing the birth of the brew. Most people think the magic happens when the water boils, but in the Topkapi Palace, the magic happens in the waiting. The coffee sits on top of the water, and the Kavasibasi waits for the union. He doesn't stir it, at least, not yet. He lets the dry powder and the cold water get to know each other in the silence of the copper pot. The snarky part of your brain wants to tell him to just get a move on, but then you look at the apprentice's hands, red and calloused from the mortar, and you realize that hurry is an insult to his labor. You don't rush the dust. You've spent an hour turning a rock-hard bean into silk, now, you have to let that silk dissolve into the soul of the water. The room is very quiet now. The tink-tink thump has stopped, leaving a ringing silence in your ears. The chief coffee maker moves the copper pot toward the bed of white ash. The slow is about to become stationary. You are watching a world where the most powerful man on earth is willing to wait 20 minutes for a 3-ounce drink, and as you stand there in the velvet dark, you realize that maybe he's onto something. Maybe the waiting is the best part. You watch as the Kavasibasi gently settles the hammered copper sezv into the bed of glowing embers and soft, silver-white ash. He doesn't just place it there, he wedges it in, burying the bottom third of the pot into the heat as if he's tucking a child into bed. There is no roar of a gas burner, no click of an electric coil. Instead, there is only the faint, almost imperceptible hiss of the heat meeting the cold metal. You realize that in this kitchen, direct flame is considered a bit barbaric, it's too fast, too violent, too likely to scorch the soul of the coffee. To make a cup fit for a sultan, you don't boil the coffee, you persuade it to warm up. Take a look at that pot. It's a work of art in itself. The mainstream history of the SThe tells us that copper was chosen not just because it looked pretty, but because it is one of the most efficient conductors of heat known to man. But in the Topkapi Palace, they took it a step further. These pots were lined with tin to prevent the copper from reacting with the coffee, and they were forged with a specific, tapering neck. This shape isn't accidental, it's designed to concentrate the heat at the bottom while allowing the foam to rise and expand in a controlled choke point at the top. It's a high-performance engine made of hand-beaten metal, designed for one specific task, the perfect thermal curve. The apprentice stands by with a silver ewer of water. This brings us to a quirky, slightly high-maintenance fact: the water in the Sultan's coffee wasn't just pulled from the nearest well. Oh no! The Ottomans were absolute water snobs. They believed that different springs had different characters and sweetness. For the Sultan's private brew, water was often brought from specific springs like the Gumasuyu, silver water, or even imported in sealed jars from the Nile, which was considered the sweetest water in the world. Imagine being the guy whose job it is to trek across a desert just to make sure the Sultan's morning coffee doesn't have a chalky finish. It's the 17th century equivalent of only using artisanal, triple-filtered volcanic water for your morning oats. You lean in, your face warmed by the radiant heat of the Mongol, the charcoal brazier. You see the first tiny, microscopic bubbles beginning to cling to the inner walls of the copper pot. They look like pearls of dew. The Kavasibasi watches them with an intensity that is almost frightening. He knows that the water is currently waking up the fine coffee dust you saw ground in the previous section. This is the infusion, the slow-motion marriage of bean and water. This brings us to a point of academic controversy that keeps Ottoman studies experts debating late into the night. Academic historians are still debating the invention of the SThe. While we associate this specific pot shape entirely with Turkish coffee today, some scholars argue that the Ottomans actually adapted it from much older Mamluk or even Yemeni designs that were originally used for boiling medicinal herbs. They suggest that the Turkish part of the coffee wasn't the pot itself, but the specific technique of burying it in hot sand or ash to create a uniform, 360-degree heat source. Was it a brand new invention of the Istanbul smiths, or a genius modification of a desert tool? Looking at the way the pot sits perfectly in the ash, you get the feeling the answer is buried somewhere deep in the Coppersmiths Guild records, which, surprise, surprise, were kept very secret. The Kavasibasi takes a small, thin silver rod and gives the mixture one single, slow, deliberate stir. Just one. He isn't whisking it, he's just ensuring there are no dry pockets of powder. Then, he withdraws the rod and goes back to being a statue. The snarky part of your brain is screaming, just turn up the heat. We've been here for 10 minutes and the water isn't even steaming yet. But you have to remember where you are. In this palace, fast means cheap. If you serve the Sultan a cup that was brewed in 3 minutes, you're basically telling him his time isn't valuable. By making it take 20 minutes, the Kavasibasi is performing a silent act of homage. He is saying, Your Majesty, even the laws of thermodynamics will slow down for you. You notice that the ash is starting to change color slightly, turning a faint grayish pink where the heat is most intense. The smell is shifting too. The raw, roasted scent is becoming more syrupy. It's starting to smell like caramelized sugar, even though there's no sugar in the pot yet. That's another thing, in the palace, sugar was often added at the beginning, or not at all, but we'll get to the Sultan's sweet tooth later. You find yourself mesmerized by the stillness. It's a complete sensory contrast to the world outside. Beyond these walls, Istanbul is a chaotic symphony of shouting merchants, braying donkeys, and the crashing waves of the Bosphorus. But here, in the coffee chamber, the loudest sound is the occasional soft crackle of a piece of charcoal settling in the brazier. It's a vacuum of sound. You realize that this slowness is a form of protection. It creates a space where the Sultan can't be rushed, where the cares of the empire have to wait until the bubbles reach the surface. The bubbles are getting bigger now. They're no longer pearls, they're starting to merge, forming a dark, shimmering ring around the edge of the pot. This is the ring of life. If the heat stays too low, the ring will never form, and the coffee will be dead. If the heat is too high, the ring will break and the coffee will boil, which, in this room, is a cardinal sin. Boiling coffee is burned coffee, fit only for the peasants in the street. The Kavasibasi adjusts the pot, moving it a mere millimeter to the left to find a slightly cooler patch of ash. His sensitivity to the temperature of the sand is better than any modern digital thermometer. You watch his hand. It's steady, relaxed, but ready. He is waiting for the rise. You realize that this is a game of chicken with a copper pot. He wants to get the coffee as close to the boiling point as possible without actually letting it boil. He's looking for the moment when the surface tension of the water finally gives way to the pressure of the steam, creating that legendary thick, velvet foam. The steam is finally starting to curl out of the neck of the SThe. It's a thin, wispy ghost of a scent, carrying notes of spice and dark fruit. You feel a strange sense of anticipation. You've seen the beans roasted, you've heard them ground into silk, and you've watched them sit in the cold ash. Now, the heat is finally winning. The union is happening. You look at the chief coffee maker's face. He isn't looking at the Sultan's door anymore. He is looking into the dark heart of the pot. He knows that in a few seconds, the foam will begin to climb, and his long, slow wait will be rewarded with a few moments of frantic precision. But for now, the ash still holds the secret. The copper is still drinking the heat. And you are still standing in the 17th century, learning that the most important ingredient in a royal cup of coffee isn't the bean or the water, it's the silence of the embers. You're leaning in so close now that the heat from the silver-white ash is starting to make your eyelashes feel a bit crispy. The Kavasibasi doesn't move, but you can see the tension in his jaw. This is it, the moment the entire empire has been waiting for. In the world of Ottoman coffee, we've moved past the selection and the grind and the thermal persuasion. We are now at the rising of the foam, or what the Turks call kopuk. If this were a movie, this is the part where the music would swell into a frantic orchestral climax, but in this kitchen, the only sound is the tiny, rhythmic pop of a single bubble breaking the surface tension. The dark crust of coffee powder you saw floating on top earlier has begun to transform. It's no longer a dry snowfall, it's a living, breathing thing. As the water underneath reaches that perfect, dangerous temperature, just a hair's breadth away from boiling, the oils from the Yemeni beans begin to emulsify. The dark brown liquid starts to lighten into a rich, golden tan color, resembling the mane of a lion or the sun hitting the dusty streets of Istanbul. It's blooming. It starts at the edges, a slow-motion ring of froth that begins to creep toward the center of the copper pot. The mainstream historical fact you need to understand here is that for the Ottomans, the foam wasn't just a garnish, it was the absolute legal tender of social status. If you served a cup of coffee without a thick, velvety layer of foam on top, you weren't just serving a bad drink, basically just told the person drinking it that they were a nobody. In the palace, a flat coffee was a direct insult to the Sultan's manna, his divine spark. The foam acts as a thermal blanket, trapping the volatile aromas and keeping the liquid beneath at a blistering temperature. No foam meant the soul of the coffee had escaped, leaving behind nothing but a bitter, cold corpse of a drink. You watch the Kavasibasi's hand hover over the long handle of the SThe. He's not grabbing it yet. He's waiting for the first rise. The foam begins to dome upward, defying the laws of gravity as it climbs the narrow neck of the pot. It's thick, like a dark chocolate souffle. If he waits 1 second too long, the dome will burst, the coffee will boil over into the ash with a frantic hiss, and the delicate flavor profile will be replaced by a harsh, burnt bitterness. It's a game of chicken with a volcano. Just as the foam reaches the very lip of the copper, he lifts the pot with a flick of his wrist. He doesn't move it away, he just holds it an inch above the heat. The foam settles. Then, he lowers it back into the ash for the second rise. And then the third. This triple rise technique is the secret to the palace brew. It creates a foam so stable and dense that you could practically rest a gold coin on top of it. Now, for a quirky, slightly mad scientist fact, in the most elite circles of the Topkapi Palace, they didn't just want foam, they wanted specific bubbles. There are obscure palace accounts suggesting that the most skilled coffee makers would use a tiny, needle-thin silver wand to groom the foam as it rose, popping the larger, ugly bubbles so that only the microscopic, uniform froth remained. They wanted the texture of sea foam on a calm day. It's the kind of obsessive-compulsive detail that only makes sense when you have a 40-man entourage and the Sultan's personal executioner watching your every move. As you watch the foam settle after the final rise, you see a young apprentice standing ready with the fincan, the small porcelain cups. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps food historians throwing metaphorical SThes at each other. Academic historians are still debating the Yemen versus Ethiopia foam mystery. Some scholars argue that the legendary thickness of Ottoman coffee foam was only possible because of the specific high-altitude, sun-dried Arabica beans coming out of Yemen at the time. They claim that modern coffee beans, even high-quality ones, simply don't have the same chemical composition to create that lion's mane froth. Others argue that it's purely a matter of the grind and the slow heat technique. The debate is essentially, was the magic in the bean or in the man? Looking at the Kavasibasi's sweat-beaded forehead, you're inclined to think that the man, part of the equation, is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. The smell in the room has shifted again. It's no longer the toasted scent of the roast, it's now the cooked scent of the brew. It's richer, deeper, with a faint hint of something like tobacco and dried cherries. You can almost feel the caffeine in the air, a phantom energy that makes the back of your neck prickle. The Kavasibasi takes a tiny silver spoon. This is a crucial moment. He doesn't just pour the coffee yet. He carefully preloads the cups. He scoops a tiny bit of the thickest, richest foam from the top of the SThe and places a dollop into each of the small porcelain cups waiting on the tray. He's ensuring that every cup gets its fair share of the soul before the liquid even arrives. It's a distribution of wealth, Ottoman style. You realize that you are watching the birth of a masterpiece. This foam is the bridge between the earth and the palace. It's a biological reaction turned into an imperial standard. The apprentice moves closer, holding the tray with a steady hand. He knows that the foam is fragile. A sudden jolt, a clumsy step, or even a heavy draft of wind from an open window could cause the bubbles to collapse. The snarky part of your brain wants to ask why they don't just use a whisk and be done with it, but then you see the way the light from the brazier reflects in the dark, shimmering bubbles. It looks like a universe of gold trapped in a copper pot. You realize that to whisk this would be to murder it. It has to grow. It has to climb. It has to want to be coffee. The kava sibisi gives a sharp, subtle nod. The coffee is ready for the journey. The foam is at its peak, stiff, glistening, and carrying the concentrated essence of the mocha beans. But the journey from the ash to the sultan's lips is a long one, through a labyrinth of silk-lined corridors and under the watchful eyes of 1,000 rivals. You find yourself holding your breath as the chief coffee maker prepares to hand off the pot. The slow is about to meet the movement. We've spent nearly half the night just getting the bubbles to rise, and you're starting to realize that in the Ottoman court, the coffee is never just a drink, it's a living entity that requires a personal bodyguard. The room is silent. The foam is perfect. And as the kava sibisi lifts the SThe for the final time, you feel a sense of historical vertigo again. You are witnessing the absolute peak of 17th-century luxury, a moment of fleeting, bubbly perfection that will be gone the moment the sultan takes his first sip. But for now, in the flickering orange light, that foam is the most important thing in the world. The kava sibisi has finished the triple rise. The foam is a thick, stable landscape of bronze bubbles, and the coffee itself is a dark, churning secret inside the copper neck of the SThe. But now comes the part where the slow actually becomes a logistical masterpiece. You'd think the chief coffee maker would just pick up a tray and walk down the hall, right? Maybe a quick stroll through the tiles, a knock on the door, and, boom, coffee served. But you have to remember, this is the Topkapi Palace. In this world, a single man walking alone with a tray is a man who isn't powerful enough to be noticed. To serve the Sultan, you don't walk, you proceed. You are about to join the human conveyor belt, a 40-man procession where every person is a specialized cog in a grand, caffeinated machine. You step out of the kitchen's warmth and into the long, echoing corridors of the harem and the privy chambers. The air here is cooler, smelling of rosewater and old stone. Ahead of you, the procession is already forming. It looks like a military drill performed in slow motion. If you were ordering coffee on an app today, you'd be checking your phone every 30 seconds, wondering why the guy on the bike is taking a detour. But here, delivery is an art form. This is Topkapi Eats, and the service fee is paid in absolute, silent obedience. The mainstream historical fact that defines this march is the rigid hierarchy of the Enderun, the palace school. The young men you see lining the halls, dressed in vibrant silk kaftans with sleeves so long they almost touch the floor, aren't just servants. They are the sons of the empire's elite, or the brightest boys recruited through the Devshirm system. They are being trained to be the future generals and bureaucrats of the Ottoman world. And their final exam? It's this. Holding a napkin. Carrying a tray. Walking in a way that doesn't make a sound. Serving coffee was the ultimate test of adab, the refined manners and self-control that separated a leader from a commoner. If you can't handle a porcelain cup with grace, how can you handle a province? You watch the master of the tray take his place. He holds a large, circular tray made of gilded silver, covered with a heavy, diamond-encrusted silk cloth known as the puzaid. Behind him are the napkin bearers, whose only job is to provide the Sultan with a fresh, embroidered silk cloth to wipe his mustache after every sip. Then come the incense bearers, swinging silver censers that puff out clouds of oud and ambergris to ensure the Sultan's olfactory experience isn't tainted by the smell of common palace dust. It's a 40-man parade for 3 ounces of liquid. Now, for a truly obscure and slightly ridiculous fact, the pheasant walk. These pages were trained to walk in a very specific style called the Suluan Yuriyusu. It involved keeping the upper body completely motionless while the legs moved in a rhythmic, gliding step, heel to toe, as if they were walking on a thin layer of ice over a deep lake. To practice, they were often forced to walk across the marble halls with a shallow bowl of water filled to the absolute brim. If they spilled a single drop, they had to start their training all over again. You watch them now, and it's uncanny. They look like they're floating. The 40 men move as one single, multi-limbed organism, their silk robes swishing with a sound like the distant sea. But as you follow this moving forest of silk and silver, you hear a faint whisper from a guard in the shadows. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps Ottoman scholars debating over their Turkish delights. Academic historians are still debating the rule of 40. Was it actually 40 people for every cup of coffee, or was 40 a symbolic number in the Ottoman world used to represent a lot or completeness? Some scholars argue that the literal 40-man procession only happened during grand state ceremonies or when foreign ambassadors were present, a sort of diplomatic flex, to show off the palace's manpower. Others insist that the Sultan's private life was even more ritualized than his public life and that 40 men really did march down the hall every time the Sultan felt like a mid-afternoon pick-me-up. Was it literal logistics or imperial theater? The truth is likely hidden in the dusty, unread accounts of the palace stewards. The snarky part of your brain is wondering what the other 37 people are actually doing. I mean, the incense swinger has a job, and the tray holder is busy, but what about the guy third from the back on the left? Well, he's a lookout. His job is to watch the feet of the person in front of him to make sure no one trips. Because if one person trips, the tray falls, the jewels clatter, the coffee spills, and everyone in this hallway is going to have a very, very bad Tuesday. It's a high-stakes, low-speed game of follow the leader. You notice that the rhythm of the walk matches the rhythm of the grind you heard earlier. Step, glide, pause. Step, glide, pause. It's hypnotic. You realize that this slowness serves a very practical purpose. It gives the coffee time to settle. Even though it's being carried through the halls, the liquid inside the copper pot is currently performing its final act of physics. The fine dust is slowly drifting to the bottom, separating itself from the foam. By the time they reach the Sultan's chamber, the coffee will be stratified, a layer of sediment, a layer of dark liquid, and a layer of golden foam. If they ran, the coffee would just be a muddy mess. The pheasant walk isn't just about grace, it's about sedimentation. The procession reaches the great velvet curtain that marks the entrance to the Sultan's private room. The curtain raiser, yes, that's a specific job, steps forward. He doesn't just pull it, he lifts it with a slow, sweeping motion that reveals the room inch by inch. The scent of the coffee is now mixing with the smell of the Sultan's private perfumes. You feel a sudden spike in the tension. This is the inner sanctum. This is where the world's most powerful man is sitting, probably annoyed that his coffee took 15 minutes to travel 50 yards, but also secretly pleased that he's the only person on earth who can command this much effort for a snack. You watch the Kavasibasi, who is leading the line, take a deep breath. His face is a mask of calm, but you can see a bead of sweat on his temple. He's about to enter the presence. He's about to perform the pour. Every step in the kitchen, every rhythmic strike of the mortar, every bubble in the ash, it's all led to this. The 40 men stop in perfect unison. The tray is lowered. The jeweled cups are prepared. You realize that you've been holding your own breath. The silence here is even heavier than in the kitchen. In the kitchen, the silence was about focus, here, the silence is about power. You are standing at the threshold of the imperial will. As the chief coffee maker steps forward to take the copper pot from the tray, you realize that the human conveyor belt has done its job. The coffee is here. It is hot. It is foamy. And most importantly, it hasn't spilled. But the hardest part isn't the walk. It's the gravity. The Kavasibasi lifts the SThe, and you see his shadow stretch across the Iznik tiles of the Sultan's floor. He is about to tilt his wrist, and you're about to see just how slowly a liquid can actually move when it's being poured for a king. You are standing now in the Sultan's private audience chamber, and the air is so still you can almost hear the dust motes settling on the heavy silk curtains. The 40-man parade has come to a silent halt, and your eyes are immediately drawn to the centerpiece of the gilded silver tray. Resting there are the fincans, the tiny, handleless porcelain cups, and their holders, the zarfs. If you were looking at these in a museum today, you'd probably wonder why anyone would bother making a cup so small it looks like it belongs in a dollhouse. But here, in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, these tiny vessels are the ultimate peak of global trade and artistic obsession. They aren't just cups, they are the stage upon which the coffee will perform its final act. You lean in just a little bit, not too close, of course, because a Janissary's sword is never far away, and you notice the porcelain. It's so thin it's almost translucent, glowing like a piece of moonlight in the dim chamber. The mainstream historical fact you should know is that the Topkapi Palace houses one of the largest and most valuable collections of Chinese porcelain in the entire world, outside of China itself. The sultans were obsessed with it. These cups were often custom-ordered from the Ming and later the Qing dynasties, traveling thousands of miles along the Silk Road or across the Indian Ocean just to reach this tray. To an Ottoman sultan, drinking from a cup made in a workshop 10,000 miles away was the ultimate proof of his universal reach. It was a 17th-century way of saying, "The world is my backyard." But wait until you see the zarf. Because the porcelain cups have no handles and the coffee is served at a temperature roughly equivalent to the surface of the sun, you can't actually touch the cup with your bare skin. That would be messy, and sultans don't do messy. So, each cup is cradled in a zarf, a decorative holder made of gold or silver. The one the Kavasibasi is reaching for right now is a masterpiece of the jeweler's art. It's filigreed gold, encrusted with diamonds so large they look like they're about to fall off, interspersed with deep, blood-red rubies. It's like a tiny, jeweled tuxedo for a thimble-sized cup. It's the ultimate flex. You realize that the holder is worth more than a medium-sized village in the Balkans. Now, for a quirky, slightly paranoid fact, there was a very specific reason the sultans preferred Chinese celadon or eggshell porcelain for their coffee and food. There was a widespread palace legend that certain types of high-quality porcelain were poison-sensitive. It was believed that if a drink containing arsenic or hemlock touched the surface of the porcelain, the cup would either change color, crack instantly, or start to sweat a dark liquid. It was a built-in security system. Given how many Ottoman princes met their end through a uniquely flavored beverage, you can see why the Sultan wouldn't mind paying top dollar for a cup that doubled as a chemical alarm. It turns out that being the most powerful man on earth involves a lot of worrying about your dishware. As the chief coffee maker carefully adjusts the cup in its jeweled holder, you notice a small group of palace scholars whispering in the shadows behind the curtain. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps art historians bickering over their magnifying glasses. Academic historians are still debating the origin of the zarf. Some scholars argue that the zarf was a purely Ottoman invention, a creative solution to the problem of handleless Chinese porcelain meeting hot Arabian coffee. Others, however, point to ancient Byzantine or even Roman perfume bottle holders and argue that the Ottomans simply repurposed an older Mediterranean design for their new caffeine obsession. The debate is essentially, was the zarf a stroke of Turkish genius or a brilliant piece of historical recycling? Depending on which museum curator you ask, you'll get a very different story about who deserves the credit for keeping the Sultan's fingers unscorched. The snarky part of your brain is thinking that for all this gold and diamond work, the cup is still only about 2 inches tall. You've seen bigger servings of cough syrup. But in this room, volume isn't the point. It's about the intensity. The coffee is so concentrated, so dark, and so potent that a full mug of it would probably cause the Sultan's heart to vibrate out of his chest. This is imperial strength brew. By using a tiny cup, they ensure that the drink stays hot until the very last drop, and that the thick, velvety foam, the kopuk we talked about earlier, covers the entire surface area. You watch the Kavasibasi's hands. They are steady, even as he handles objects that could buy a fleet of ships. He places the cup and its holder on the silver tray with a sound so faint it's more like a vibration than a noise. Click. The porcelain meets the gold. The gold meets the tray. It's a symphony of luxury played at a decibel level only a bat could hear. Everything is ready now. The stage is set. The Sultan is seated on a throne of cushions, his face a mask of imperial indifference, but you can see his eyes tracking the tray. He knows the ritual. He knows the weight of the moment. The coffee inside the copper SThe has settled. The fine dust has moved to the bottom, leaving the dark, rich liquid in the middle and the bronze foam on top. You realize that the slow is about to reach its final, agonizing peak. The Kavasibasi is positioning himself. He's checking the angle of his wrist. He's checking the distance between the lip of the copper pot and the rim of the porcelain cup. If he's too high, the coffee will splash, and the foam will break. If he's too low, the foam won't transfer properly. He needs to find the golden arc. The silence in the room is so thick you feel like you could reach out and grab a handful of it. The 40 servants are frozen, looking like a collection of statues in a garden. Even the incense bearers have stopped swinging their censers, the smoke rising in straight, silver lines toward the ceiling. You find yourself holding your breath, your heart beating in time with the flickering oil lamps. The Kavasibasi lifts the copper pot. His arm is an extension of the metal. He leans forward, just a fraction of an inch. You see the first dark shimmer of the liquid appearing at the mouth of the SThe. This is it. The pour is starting. But don't blink, because at this rate, you might be here until dawn just watching the first drop. You are about to see just how much patience can be squeezed into a single porcelain cup, and you're starting to realize that in the Topkapi Palace, the beauty isn't in the drinking, it's in the agonizing, beautiful, slow-motion arrival. You're watching the Kavasibasi's hand, and it's perfectly, eerily still. He has lifted the copper SThe from the embers, and he's holding it just inches away from the jeweled fincan, but he isn't pouring. Not yet. The Sultan is waiting, the guards are waiting, and you, standing there in the flickering shadows, are probably wondering if the chief coffee maker has suddenly turned into a statue. You might feel the urge to nudge him, to whisper, "Hey, buddy, the emperor is thirsty," but in this chamber, that nudge would likely be the last thing your hand ever did. This is the sacred pause, the moment of settling. In the Ottoman court, patience isn't just a virtue, it's a prerequisite for staying alive. The mainstream historical fact you need to grasp in this silence is the nature of the telv, the coffee dregs. Because Ottoman coffee is unfiltered, the ground powder we saw earlier remains inside the pot during the entire brewing process. It doesn't disappear, it transforms. At this very moment, inside the dark, steaming liquid of the SThe, a microscopic battle is taking place. The fine silt is slowly losing its battle with gravity, drifting down through the liquid to form a thick, velvety layer at the bottom. To the Ottomans, pouring too early was the mark of a barbarian. If the silt hasn't settled, the coffee is angry and muddy. A polite cup of coffee is a quiet cup, where the dregs have made peace with the bottom of the vessel, leaving only the clear, potent essence for the Sultan to enjoy. You look at the Sultan. He hasn't blinked. He's staring at the copper pot with the same intensity he might use to watch a distant enemy army on the horizon. To him, this wait is a sign of respect. It shows that the Kavasibasi is a master of time. If the coffee maker rushes the pour, he is essentially saying the Sultan's palate isn't refined enough to tell the difference. By making the Sultan wait those extra 60 seconds, the coffee maker is elevating the drink from a mere beverage to a high-stakes ceremony of physics and etiquette. Now, for a quirky, slightly bizarre fact that you won't find in the how-to guides for modern Turkish coffee, the dregs weren't always seen as waste. In the private inner circles of the palace, the telv was considered a potent substance with its own life. There are obscure palace records suggesting that the dregs were occasionally collected and used as a base for a rudimentary type of ink for secret messages, or even applied to the skin as a royal salve for minor burns. But the most famous use, which was starting to take root even then, was tasseography, fortune-telling. It was believed that the way the dregs settled, even before they left the pot, could tell a skilled observer something about the Sultan's mood for the day. You realize that the Kavasibasi isn't just waiting for gravity, he's reading the silt like a dark, muddy crystal ball. As you stand in the heavy silence, you notice a whisper from one of the court historians in the back. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps Ottoman specialists debating over their own afternoon brews. Academic historians are still debating the consistently syrupy question: was 17th century court coffee actually a liquid as we know it, or was it a thick, viscous syrup? Some scholars argue, based on descriptions from early European travelers who were lucky enough to get a taste, that the Sultan's coffee was so concentrated and so full of dissolved solids that it was more like a dark honey or a liquid paste than a modern cup of coffee. They suggest that the pour had to be slow because the liquid was physically too thick to move any faster. Others argue that this is a translation error and that the coffee was liquid, just incredibly strong. The debate is essentially, was the Sultan drinking coffee, or was he eating a caffeinated soup? The snarky part of your brain is imagining the Sultan trying to drink a cup of coffee-flavored molasses while trying to maintain his imperial dignity. But look at the Kavasibasi again. He is watching the shoulders of the copper pot. He's looking for the moment when the liquid at the top becomes translucent enough to reveal the dark depth beneath. This is the mirror moment. In the Topkapi Palace, the best coffee was said to have a surface so dark and still that the Sultan could see his own reflection in the foam before he took a sip. If the sediment is still floating, the mirror is cracked. You notice a bead of sweat slowly rolling down the Kavasibasi's temple. He's been holding that heavy copper pot in a fixed position for nearly 2 minutes. His muscles must be screaming, but his hand is like a mountain. This is the physical toll of palace luxury. We talk about the beauty and the jewels, but we forget that someone had to hold their breath and freeze their muscles just so a liquid could settle in a specific way. You realize that in this room, rest is a performance. The sediment is resting, but the man is enduring. The smell has deepened. It's no longer the bright, toasted aroma of the grind, it's now a heavy, almost floral scent that seems to cling to the velvet hangings of the room. It's intoxicating. You feel a bit lightheaded just standing near it. This is the concentration. Because the pot is so small and the heat was so slow, the coffee has become a distilled essence of the Yemeni hills. The Kavasibasi makes a tiny, almost invisible movement with his thumb. It's the signal. The dregs have reached the bottom. The mirror is clear. The angry particles have been tamed by the silence. He is ready to begin the final descent. You find yourself leaning forward on your tiptoes, your own hands clenching at your sides. The 40 servants are still statues, the Sultan is still a masked god of indifference, and the oil lamps are still flickering in the draught. The slow has reached its absolute limit. If he waits any longer, the coffee will lose its heat, and a lukewarm cup is just as big a crime as a muddy one. The chief coffee maker tilts his wrist. Not a quarter inch, not an eighth, just a microscopic shift in the angle of the copper. You see the surface of the coffee move for the first time in what feels like an hour. It's a slow, oily wave that pushes against the lip of the SThe. You realize that everything we've seen so far, the months of camel travel, the gold keys, the golden mortar, the triple rise of the foam, it was all just the prologue. The slow isn't a delay, it's a build-up. It's the tension of a bowstring being pulled back until it can't go any further. And now, the string is about to be released. You are about to see the most famous pour in the world, a stream of liquid so thin it looks like a single strand of dark silk. Don't blink. The first drop is about to leave the pot, and in this palace, that drop carries the weight of 500 years of tradition. The tilt has finally happened. You watch as the Kavasibasi's wrist moves with the microscopic precision of a diamond cutter, and for a heartbeat, nothing seems to change. Then, a single, dark, viscous strand of liquid, so thin it looks like a stray thread of black silk, emerges from the lip of the copper SThe. It doesn't splash. It doesn't even seem to fall. It descends. It moves with a terrifying, heavy slowness, like honey caught in a cold room, or a secret being whispered into a dark well. You realize that you are watching the golden thread, the absolute pinnacle of Ottoman coffee artistry. If he pours any faster, he is a commoner. If he pours any slower, the liquid might actually start to travel back up the pot. You lean in, your eyes fixed on the point where that dark thread meets the porcelain cup. This is where the physics of the palace gets truly weird. Remember that dollop of thick, bronze foam, the kopuk, that the Kavasibasi placed in the cup earlier? The goal of this slow pour is to slide the hot liquid underneath that foam without breaking it. He isn't just filling a cup, he's lifting a veil. He wants to float the foam on top of the liquid as it rises, keeping it intact like a pristine crown. If that dark thread of coffee hits the center of the foam and causes it to collapse, the ritual is a failure. You see him aiming for the very edge of the cup, let the liquid slide down the curved porcelain wall like a stealthy intruder. The mainstream historical fact you should know about this moment is that the foam was the ultimate litmus test of Ottoman hospitality. In the 17th century, if a bride-to-be served coffee to her future father-in-law and the foam was thin or broken, the marriage might actually be called off right then and there. It was seen as a sign of her character, her patience, her attention to detail, and her respect for tradition. In the Sultan's chamber, this is amplified by 1,000. The Kavasibasi's entire career, his influence over the Sultan, and perhaps his very life, are currently riding on the structural integrity of a few thousand tiny bubbles. You watch him hold the pot steady, his muscles locked in an isometric struggle against the weight of the copper, and you realize that making coffee is a high-stakes sport in this palace. Now, for a truly obscure and slightly poetic fact, the hairline stream. In the most elite coffee circles of Istanbul, it was said that a true master could pour a stream of coffee so thin that you could pass a single human hair through it without the hair getting wet. It sounds like a legend, but as you watch the Kavasibasi now, you start to believe it. The stream is so consistent, so unwavering, that it looks like a solid rod of dark glass connecting the pot to the cup. There is no wobbling, no dripping, no variation. It's a feat of human control that makes a modern laser level look a bit clumsy. He is fighting the natural glug of liquid leaving a spout, using the narrow neck of the SThe to tame the flow into a silent, unbroken line. As the liquid slowly, agonizingly fills the bottom third of the cup, you notice the Sultan's eyes haven't moved. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps Ottoman historians arguing in their velvet-lined libraries. Academic historians are still debating the staccato versus continuous pour. Some scholars argue, based on 17th-century palace manuals, that the pour wasn't one single stream, but a series of 3 distinct stages, the heart, the body, and the soul, with a tiny, 5-second pause between each to allow the temperature to equalize. They believe the Kavasibasi is currently in the body phase. Other scholars insist this is a later interpretation and that the classic imperial pour was always a single, eternal stream, that never broke from the first drop to the last. Was it a rhythmic pulse or a silent flow? The debate is essentially, was the Sultan's coffee a song or a poem? The snarky part of your brain is wondering if the coffee is even still hot. I mean, we've been watching this liquid travel through the air at the speed of a tired snail. But look at the steam. It isn't billowing out, it's rising in a single, straight, silver needle from the cup. The Kavasibasi is pouring from a specific height, exactly 3 inches above the rim, which allows the air to cool the liquid just enough so that the Sultan can drink it immediately, but not enough to lose the sting of the heat. It's a thermal calculation performed in real time by a man who doesn't have a thermometer but has the collective memory of 10 generations of coffee makers in his wrist. You realize that the slow is actually a form of tension. The longer the pour takes, the more the aroma is released into the room. It's like a scented bomb going off in slow motion. The smell of the dark, Yemeni roast is now so thick it feels like a physical presence against your skin. It's a sensory overload. You feel your own senses sharpening, your focus narrowing down until the only thing in the universe is that dark, silk thread and the rising level of the liquid in the porcelain fin-can. The Cavasibasi's hand begins to rise, just a fraction. As the cup fills, he has to increase the height of the pot to maintain the hairline stream without letting it splash. It's a vertical dance. You watch the foam in the cup, it's being lifted by the dark liquid beneath it, rising like a tide. It's holding. It's staying thick and bronze and beautiful. You see the reflection of the Sultan's jeweled turban in the rising surface of the coffee. The mirror is nearly complete. There is a sound now, a sound so faint you have to strain to hear it. It's the sound of the liquid meeting the liquid. It isn't a splash, it's a soft, wet hiss, like the sound of a silk dress dragging across a marble floor. It's the only sound in the room, and it's louder than a drum in this imperial silence. You realize that the 40 servants aren't just standing there, they are holding their breath in unison. If one person exhales too loudly, the draft could move the stream. The cup is 3/4 full. The Cavasibasi is approaching the soul phase, the final few drops that carry the most concentrated flavor. This is the danger zone. If he stops too abruptly, a stray drop will fall and ruin the rim of the cup. If he goes too long, he'll pour the angry dregs into the quiet cup. He has to find the absolute, perfect exit strategy. You find yourself clenching your own jaw in sympathy. Your eyes are watering from the strain of not blinking. You realize that you have never seen anything as intense as a man pouring 4 ounces of coffee. It's more dramatic than a cavalry charge, more tense than a diplomatic summit. It's the absolute triumph of human patience over the frantic pace of the world. The Cavasibasi's wrist begins a final, slow rotation. He is preparing to break the stream. You see the liquid in the pot getting low. The dark, muddy sediment is waiting at the back of the SThe, held back by the angle of his tilt. He is skimming the pure liquid off the top of the mud with the precision of a surgeon. The stream begins to thin. It goes from a thread to a hair, and then to a series of dark, glowing pearls. The cup is full. The foam is crowning the rim, looking like a bronze dome. The Cavasibasi lifts the pot vertically, cutting the air with the lip of the copper. He did it. Not a drop on the rim. Not a break in the foam. The pour is over. But as he pulls the pot away, you realize the ritual isn't done. The cup is full, but it hasn't been given yet. And in this palace, the giving is just as slow as the pouring. You prepare yourself for section 11, where we find out that even picking up a tray can take an eternity when you're doing it for the King of Kings. The Cavasibasi has finally broken the stream. He stands there for a moment, the empty copper SThe still held aloft, and the silence in the Sultan's chamber is so profound you can hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock from the hallway, a sound that feels like a rhythmic pulse in the dark. The cup is full. The bronze foam is crowning the rim. But don't think for a second that the slow part is over. In fact, we are just entering the most dangerous phase of the night. You watch as the chief coffee maker places the jeweled fin-can onto a tiny, gilded silver tray. He moves with a gravity that suggests he is carrying a live explosive. He isn't just handing over a drink, he is delivering a political thermometer. In the Ottoman court, coffee wasn't just a beverage, it was a high-stakes language where the speed of a sip or the temperature of the porcelain could decide the fate of a province or the life of a grand vizier. The mainstream historical fact you need to understand is that the Ottoman court was a place of symphonic protocol. Everything had a meaning. Every gesture was a code. By the 17th century, coffee had become the official timer for imperial audiences. When a foreign ambassador or a high-ranking official was granted a meeting with the Sultan, the arrival of the coffee was the signal that the business was concluding. But here's the catch, the Sultan's behavior with the cup was the only status update you were going to get. If the Sultan drank his coffee quickly while it was still piping hot, it was a sign of favor and energy. If he let it sit on the tray, watching the steam fade into the cold air of the chamber, it was a silent, terrifying message that the audience was over and the Sultan was displeased. You realize that you are looking at a cup of liquid that doubles as a read receipt for an entire empire. You watch the Kavasibasi take those final, pheasant-glide, steps toward the Sultan. He stops exactly 3 paces away. He doesn't look the Sultan in the eye, that would be an act of suicide. Instead, he looks at the Sultan's chest, waiting for the slight inclination of the head that says, "I am ready to receive." This is the moment where the coffee becomes a weapon of diplomacy. The Kavasibasi must present the tray in such a way that the Sultan doesn't have to reach too far, but also doesn't feel crowded. It's a spatial negotiation performed in total silence. Now, for a truly quirky and slightly chilling fact, the coffee of death. In the darker chapters of Topkapi history, there was a specific, terrifying protocol for officials who had fallen out of favor. If a Grand Vizier was summoned to a private meeting and served coffee that was unusually bitter, or if it was served in a cup that was noticeably different from the others, it was often a signal that his executioner was waiting behind the silk curtain. There are stories of officials drinking their final cup with a steady hand, knowing that the slow pour they had just witnessed was the last beautiful thing they would ever see. The coffee was a way to maintain the imperial calm even in the face of a death sentence. It's the ultimate, snarky move by the dynasty, making your demise as elegant and caffeinated as possible. As you stand in the shadows, watching the Sultan's jeweled hand reach out for the zarf, you notice the court scribes in the back holding their breath. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps Ottoman scholars arguing over their own Turkish delights. Academic historians are still debating the harem coffee protocol. For centuries, it was believed that the Sultan only drank coffee in the company of men, his advisors, his guards, and his eunuchs. However, some scholars, looking at newly translated letters and harem inventory lists, argue that the Sultan's most important, coffee diplomacy, actually happened behind the closed doors of the harem, with the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother. They suggest that the real, power coffee was shared between the Sultan and his mother, and that the public ritual was just a performance for the men. Was the Kavasibasi serving the state or was he serving a family secret? The debate is essentially, who was the true chief coffee maker, the man in the silk robe or the woman behind the curtain? The snarky part of your brain is wondering if the Sultan ever just wanted to say, "Can we just skip the 40 men and the jewels and just give me the caffeine?" But then you see his face as he finally wraps his fingers around the diamond-encrusted holder. There is a look of absolute, concentrated focus. He isn't just a ruler, he's a connoisseur. He knows that the liquid inside that cup is the result of a month-long journey and a 2-hour ritual. By drinking it, he is consuming the very essence of his empire's luxury. You realize that the slow is a form of psychological dominance. By making everyone in the room, including himself, wait for the pour, wait for the settling, and wait for the presentation, the Sultan is proving that he is the master of time itself. While the rest of the world is rushing to catch ships and fight wars, in this room, time has to wait for a porcelain cup. It's a form of imperial meditation. As the Sultan lifts the cup to his lips, the silence in the chamber reaches a point of absolute, crystalline tension. You notice the steam catching the light from the oil lamps, curling around the Sultan's fingers like a ghostly ribbon. The smell of the coffee is now mixing with the sharp scent of the Sultan's private tobacco. It's a heady, masculine aroma of power. You realize that you are witnessing the closing of the loop. The green bean from Mocha has finally reached the throne of Istanbul. The hairline stream has become a royal sip. But don't think it's over. As the Sultan takes that first sip, his eyes flick toward a small glass of clear water sitting on the tray. He hasn't touched it yet, and in the Ottoman court, the order in which you drink the water and the coffee is a code so complex it could make a cryptographer quit his job. If he drinks the water first, it means one thing. If he drinks it after, it means another. You realize that even the Sultan's thirst is a part of the political game. You find yourself leaning forward, your own throat feeling dry from the tension. You've watched the 40-man parade, you've watched the silk threads of the pour, and you've seen the jewels of the holder. But the story of the cup is only half told. There is still the ritual of the water and the etiquette of the sweet to contend with. The Sultan's sip is just the beginning of the imperial Kiev. The chief coffee maker stands back, his hands folded in his sleeves, his eyes fixed on the floor. He has done his part. He has delivered the liquid without a spill. Now, he is just a spectator to the Sultan's reaction. He is waiting to see if the coffee is quiet enough, if the foam is bronze enough, and if the temperature is sovereign enough. You feel a sense of historical awe settling over you. You aren't just in a palace, you're in a clockwork universe where every gear is made of silk, gold, and coffee dregs. As the Sultan's mustache brushes the bronze foam, you realize that the Ottoman Empire wasn't just built on gunpowder and law, it was built on the agonizing, beautiful patience of a single, slow-motion cup. You're standing there, barely breathing, watching the Sultan's fingers, those powerful, rings-heavy fingers, close around the diamond-encrusted zarf. The cup is finally in his hand. But before the coffee even touches his lips, your eyes flick to a small, elegant glass of water sitting on the same silver tray. It's not just any glass, it's a piece of sesame bulbul, or nightingale's eye glass, with delicate blue spirals swirling through the crystal. You might think, oh, he's just thirsty from all that waiting, but in this room, even a sip of water is a coded message. If you were a courtier standing in the back of the room, you'd be staring at that water glass like it was a ticking time bomb. This is the water prelude, and it is the ultimate test of the kitchen's timing. The mainstream historical fact you need to tuck into your mental kaftan is that the water served with Ottoman coffee wasn't there to wash down a bitter taste. It was there to prepare the palate. The Ottomans believed that to truly experience the soul of the Yemeni bean, your mouth had to be a blank canvas. The water cleanses the tongue of any lingering flavors of lamb, spices, or tobacco, ensuring that the first hit of coffee is pure, unadulterated imperial luxury. It's the 17th century equivalent of resetting the system before launching a high-performance program. If the Sultan drinks the water and finds it even a fraction too warm or too cold, the entire 40-man parade we saw earlier might as well have stayed in bed. Now, for a quirky, slightly secret agent fact, the water was actually a silent communication system between the Sultan and his head chef. In the Topkapi Palace, there was a secret code known only to the inner circle. If the Sultan reached for the water before the coffee, it was a subtle, terrifying signal that he was hungry. It meant the previous meal hadn't been sufficient, or he was in the mood for an immediate feast. The moment that glass touched his lips, a runner would be dispatched from the shadows of the chamber to the great kitchens, and within minutes, 100 chefs would be frantically preparing a multi-course banquet. If he drank the coffee first, he was satisfied and, in his Kiev. You realize that the Kava Sibisi isn't just a coffee maker, he's a human dashboard light for the Sultan's stomach. As the Sultan finally lifts the porcelain fin can to his mustache, you notice the chief coffee maker's eyes narrow just a fraction. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps food historians bickering over their copper pots. Academic historians are still debating the great sugar mystery. Most modern Turkish coffee is ordered with specific levels of sugar, sod, plain, orta, medium, or şekerli, sweet. But some scholars argue that in the 17th century palace, sugar was considered a peasant's mask for bad beans and was strictly forbidden in the Sultan's cup. They claim the Sultan only drank it bitter to prove his masculine endurance. Others, however, point to the massive palace expenditures for sugar and honey and argue that the Sultan's coffee was actually a thick, syrupy confection, more like liquid candy than a beverage. Was the Sultan a bitter purist or a sugar addict? Depending on which historian you ask, you'll get a very different picture of the imperial palate. The snarky part of your brain is wondering how the Sultan manages to drink this without getting foam all over his face. I mean, we spent 15 minutes making that lion's mane froth, and now it's basically a barricade between him and the liquid. But watch his technique. He doesn't just gulp it down like a morning commuter. He sips it with a very specific, soft, slurping sound. In modern etiquette, that might get you kicked out of a fancy dinner, but here, it's a sign of a connoisseur. By slurping, the Sultan is aerating the coffee, spreading the microscopic oils across his entire tongue and letting the aroma travel up to his nasal passages. He's deconstructing the flavor in real time. It's a loud, imperial, and deeply satisfied sound. You notice a servant standing to the left, holding a very specific, long, embroidered silk cloth. This is the mustache attendant. His entire job, his whole career, really, is to wait for the exact moment the Sultan pulls the cup away so he can dart in and dab away any stray bronze foam from the royal facial hair. You realize that in this palace, there is no such thing as a simple action. Every sip is followed by a dab, every dab is followed by a bow. It's a rhythmic, high-stakes game of clean the emperor. If the attendant is too slow, the Sultan looks messy. If he's too fast, he's being aggressive. It's a tightrope walk performed with a piece of silk. The room remains silent, save for that rhythmic, imperial slurp. You can see the Sultan's eyes closing. This is the arrival. The caffeine is starting to hit his system, but because it's so concentrated and was brewed so slowly, it's not a jolt, it's a glow. He is entering a state of high-functioning meditation. You realize that the slow pour wasn't just about the aesthetics, it was about the chemistry. The slow heat extraction has pulled out the most complex sugars and oils from the Yemeni beans without releasing the harsh, jittery tannins. The Sultan isn't getting a buzz, he's getting a revelation. You find yourself mesmerized by the way the light from the silver lamps reflects in the Sultan's cup. The dark liquid is disappearing, revealing the white porcelain beneath, but the foam is so thick it actually clings to the sides of the cup, creating a map of the Sultan's sips. In the palace, they called these the steps of the soul. A master coffee maker could look at the empty cup and tell exactly how much the Sultan enjoyed the brew by how the foam settled. The Kava Sibisi stands perfectly still, his hands folded. He's watching the Sultan's throat. Every swallow is a victory. Every sigh is a promotion. You realize that the chief coffee maker's entire life is calibrated to the rhythm of another man's gulps. It's a strange, intimate, and slightly claustrophobic form of power. He knows the Sultan's moods better than the Sultan's own wives, all through the language of the bean. The Sultan finally lowers the cup. He doesn't place it back on the tray yet. He holds it for a few seconds, letting the heat of the porcelain warm his palm. This is the afterglow. The 40 servants haven't moved a muscle. The incense bearers are still, the guards are statues, and you, the invisible witness, feel a strange sense of historical completion. You've seen the bean travel from the sun-drenched hills of Yemen to the diamond-studded hands of the caliph. But don't get too relaxed. The cup is empty, but the ritual has one final, sugary surprise. In the Ottoman court, you never end on a bitter note. The sweet ending is coming, and in this palace, a piece of candy is treated with the same military precision as a cavalry charge. You look at the Kava Sibisi as he signals for the next tray, and you realize that your long, slow journey through the Topkapi night is about to get a whole lot sweeter. You're standing there in the velvet silence of the chamber, watching the Sultan slowly lower his porcelain cup, a look of profound, keyif, or blissful satisfaction spreading across his face. The Kava Sibisi, the chief coffee maker, remains a statue, eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for the next cue. It's such a peaceful, refined scene that it's almost impossible to imagine that just a few generations ago, this very act of drinking coffee could have gotten you, the Sultan, and everyone in this room a very short, very permanent meeting with a silk bowstring. You realize that the slow pour hasn't always been an imperial luxury. For a time, it was an imperial crime. As the Sultan wipes a stray bronze bubble from his lip, you can't help but think about the man who turned Istanbul into a city of caffeinated secrets, Sultan Murad IV. The mainstream historical fact that you need to wrap your head around is the Great Coffee Ban of 1633. Murad IV was essentially the angry boss of the Ottoman dynasty. He came to power in a time of absolute chaos, rebellions, fires, and political backstabbing, and he decided that the best way to fix the empire was to ban everything that made people talk. He looked at the coffee houses of Istanbul and didn't see people enjoying a brew, he saw underground laboratories of sedition. To Murad, coffee was the fuel of revolution. He famously decreed that anyone caught drinking coffee or smoking tobacco would be executed on the spot. He shut down every coffee house in the city, turning Istanbul into a very sleepy, very grumpy metropolis. You realize that the chief coffee maker we saw earlier would have been out of a job, or out of a head, back in those days. Now, for a quirky and honestly quite terrifying fact about Murad's enforcement, he was the original, undercover boss, but with a much higher body count. Murad IV used to dress up as a commoner, throwing a rough wool cloak over his imperial silks, and wander the dark, winding streets of Istanbul at night. He wasn't alone, though, he usually had a silent executioner trailing a few paces behind him in the shadows. Murad would walk into back alleys and pretend to be looking for a forbidden sip of the dark liquid. If a brave, or foolish, soul offered him a cup or a pipe, Murad would drop his disguise and signal his executioner. It is said he killed hundreds, if not thousands, of his own subjects personally during these midnight patrols. Imagine being the guy who just wanted a midnight snack and a caffeine hit, only to find out the tourist asking for a sip is actually the emperor of the world with a very sharp sword. It's the ultimate, snarky, reminder that in the 17th century, your barista might literally be your judge. As you watch the current sultan reach for a second, even smaller glass of water, you notice the Kavasibasi's hand tremble slightly, just a microscopic vibration. Perhaps he's thinking about the history of his office, too. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps Ottoman specialists debating over their own afternoon brews. Academic historians are still debating the real motivation behind Murad's ban. One side argues that it was purely a matter of political security, that the Sultan was terrified of the gossip and plotting that happened in coffeehouses. But another group of scholars, looking at medical texts from the era, argues that Murad actually believed coffee was a literal poison or a madness-inducing drug that was physically destroying the brains of the janissaries and the ruling class. They suggest the ban was a 17th-century war on drugs fueled by legitimate medical fear rather than just political paranoia. Was he a tyrant or a very misguided public health official? The debate is essentially, was the Sultan protecting his throne or his subjects' sanity? The snarky part of your brain is wondering if Murad IV was just a morning person who hated everyone else's joy. But then you look at the way the current Sultan handles the cup. He treats it with a reverence that borders on the religious. He knows that his power comes from this balance of fear and luxury. By drinking the coffee that his ancestor once banned, he is proving that he has conquered the chaos. He has tamed the bean, tamed the city, and turned a rebellion in a cup into an imperial ritual. The slow pour is a victory lap. You find yourself staring at the nightingale's eye water glass again. The Sultan takes a sip, and you realize that even the water tastes of victory. The air in the room is getting even thicker, the scent of the dark roast mixing with the cooling embers of the charcoal. You realize that the slow isn't just a style, it's an evolution. It took the empire 100 years to move from executing coffee drinkers to building a 40-man parade for a single cup. It's a lesson in how humans will always find a way to get their caffeine fix, even if the guy with the sword says no. There's a quirky bit of palace lore about Murad IV's own secret habits. Some whisper that even while he was out executing people for drinking the dark devil's spit, the Sultan himself was secretly addicted to the stuff. There are accounts from his private doctor suggesting he drank a thick, syrupy version of coffee behind closed doors to keep up his energy for his night patrols. If it's true, it's the ultimate hypocritical flex. The man who banned coffee for everyone else was the only one allowed to be caffeinated. You look at the current Kavasibasi and wonder if he ever feels the irony. He's the descendant of a line of men who were once criminals and are now kings of the kitchen. The Sultan puts the cup down for the final time. The foam has left a dark, beautiful ring around the inside of the porcelain, those steps of the soul we talked about earlier. He looks satisfied. The Murad tension has faded into the Imperial Kiev. But as we move toward the final sections of the night, you realize that the story of Ottoman coffee isn't just about the palace. It's about how this liquid escaped the Sultan's walls and went on to conquer the world, one coffeehouse at a time. You notice the chief coffee maker signaling to a servant in the back. A new, smaller tray is being brought forward. On it sits a single, gleaming silver bowl with a lid shaped like a dome. This is the Turkish delight, the lokum. In the palace, you never leave the bitter taste of the coffee as the final memory. You must seal the ritual with sweetness. You find yourself leaning forward again, your own mouth watering at the thought of a piece of rose-scented sugar. You've survived the history lesson, survived the undercover boss, terrors of Murad IV, and now you're ready for the reward. The servant approaches with the tray. The lid is lifted with a slow, sweeping motion, because of course it is. Everything in this palace is a slow-motion reveal. The scent of rose and lemon fills the air, cutting through the heavy aroma of the roast. You realize that you've reached the final, sweet, chapter of the night. The Sultan's fingers move toward the silver bowl, and as he selects a piece of powdered sugar-covered delight, you realize that the slow pour has successfully transitioned into the sweet end. You're watching the Sultan slowly chew that last piece of rose-scented Turkish delight, the powdered sugar leaving a faint, ghostly dusting on his dark silk robes. The Kavasibasi, the chief coffee maker, has begun the silent, methodical process of clearing the tray. The jeweled zarf is being lifted, the empty porcelain cup is being tucked back into its velvet-lined case, and the copper sezv is being returned to the younger apprentice. This ritual, which felt like it might stretch on until the next century, is finally drawing to a close. But as you stand there in the cooling shadows of the privy chamber, you realize that the slow pour you just witnessed wasn't just staying inside these walls. Like the aroma of the Yemeni beans, this culture was too potent to be contained by marble and janissary guards. You are witnessing the very moment when the imperial secret began to leak into the streets, changing the social DNA of the world forever. The mainstream historical fact that you should hold on to as we leave the Sultan's presence is that the 16th and 17th centuries weren't just the age of conquest for the Ottomans, they were the age of the coffeehouse. While the Sultan was enjoying his triple-rise foam in total seclusion, the commoners of Istanbul were busy inventing a whole new way of being human. In 1554, two merchants opened the first public coffeehouses in the district of Tahtakali. They called them Mektap-i Irfan, schools of the cultured. Before coffee, if you wanted to socialize, you went to a mosque, a market, or a bathhouse. But the coffeehouse was different. It was a place where you didn't just pray or trade, you talked. You gossiped. You argued about the price of silk and the quality of the Sultan's latest military campaign. You realized that the slow pour in the palace became the long conversation in the city. Now, for a quirky and honestly quite progressive fact about Ottoman marriage law, the caffeine divorce. Believe it or not, in the 15th and 16th centuries, coffee was considered such a fundamental human necessity in Istanbul that it was actually encoded into marriage contracts. According to certain legal traditions of the time, a woman could legally sue for divorce if her husband failed to provide her with a sufficient daily quota of coffee. Imagine standing before a judge and saying, "Your Honor, he's a great guy, but the pantry is empty of mocha beans," and actually winning. It's the ultimate 17th century, snarky, reminder that even in a strictly patriarchal society, the Ottoman women knew exactly how to protect their right to a morning brew. If you didn't have the slow pour at home, you were legally allowed to go find it elsewhere. As you follow the Kavasibasi back toward the kitchen, you see the flickering lights of the city through a high, arched window. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps social historians arguing over their third cup of the day. Academic historians are still debating the democratizing power of the coffeehouse. One group of scholars argues that the coffeehouse was the world's first, truly democratic space, where a shoemaker could sit next to a government clerk and share a drink and an opinion. They claim coffee was the great leveler that broke down the rigid Ottoman class system. However, another group of scholars argues that this is a westernized romanticization. They suggest that the coffeehouse actually reinforced hierarchies, with specific ranks of seating and exclusive clubs for different guilds and ethnicities. Was the coffeehouse a cradle of liberty or just another theater for social status? The debate is essentially, did coffee make people equal, or did it just give them a new place to feel superior to each other? The snarky part of your brain is wondering if the commoners also had a 40-man entourage just to get a cup. Probably not. In the streets of Eminonu, you didn't have diamond-encrusted zarfs. You had a humble ceramic cup and a wooden stool. But the slow was still there. Even in the busiest market, you didn't grab and go. You sat. You watched the world. You waited for the dregs to settle, just like the Sultan. You realized that coffee gave the entire empire a collective pause. It taught millions of people that the best things in life require you to stop moving for at least 20 minutes. You noticed the apprentice cleaning the golden mortar we saw earlier. He's moving with a bit more speed now that the Sultan is served, but the rhythm is still in his muscles. This transition from deep palace seclusion to public coffee culture is what eventually brought the Turkish style to Europe. You might remember the story of the siege of Vienna in 1683, where the retreating Ottomans supposedly left behind bags of camel fodder that turned out to be coffee beans. You realize that the very ritual you've been watching tonight, the triple rise, the fine grind, the slow settling, is the mother of every coffeehouse in Vienna, Paris, and London. The Topkapi Palace was the research and development lab for a global addiction. There's a quirky bit of lore about the coffeehouse spies. Because coffeehouses were the only places where people could talk freely, the Ottoman government was absolutely obsessed with eavesdropping on them. Every coffeehouse had a regular, who was actually a paid informant for the Grand Vizier. They would sit in the corner, nursing a cup for hours, just listening for any whisper of a rebellion or a joke about the Sultan's weight. You look at the Kavasibasi and realize he's basically the chief informant, inside the palace, while thousands of mini coffee makers were doing the same thing in the streets. Coffee and secrets have always been brewed in the same pot. The Sultan has finished his keyif and is being led toward his sleeping quarters. The room is being cleared. The smell of the incense is fading, leaving only the ghost of the dark roast. You realize that the slow pour is a metaphor for the empire itself, a vast, complex, and beautiful machine that moved at its own deliberate pace, refusing to be hurried by the rising powers of the West. As long as the coffee was pouring slowly, the empire felt eternal. You find yourself looking at the empty silver tray one last time. It's a beautiful, lonely object in the moonlight. You've seen the forbidden coffee of Murad IV, the diamond coffee of the Sultan, and the political coffee of the coffeehouses. You've traveled through the fire, the dust, the foam, and the silk. You're starting to realize that the rhythm of the Ottoman night isn't just about caffeine, it's about the refusal to let the world move too fast. The apprentice puts a cover over the charcoal brazier. The glowing orange light disappears, replaced by the cool, blue-silver of the Istanbul moon. We are moving toward the final chapter. The Sultan is asleep, the city is whispering, and all that remains of tonight's ceremony is a layer of dark, velvety dregs at the bottom of a porcelain cup. You're ready for the end. You're ready to see what the empire in a cup looks like when the liquid is gone. You are standing in the absolute, velvety silence of the Sultan's private chamber. The 40-man procession has vanished back into the stone labyrinth of the palace, their silk robes no longer swishing against the marble. The Sultan has retired to his quarters, and the only light left comes from a single, dying oil lamp and the cold, silver moonlight reflecting off the Bosphorus through the high windows. You look down at the silver tray, and there it is, the empty porcelain fincan. The imperial coffee is gone, the keyif has been achieved, and all that remains is a thick, dark layer of telv, the dregs, clinging to the bottom and the sides of the cup. It looks like a miniature, muddy landscape of mountain ranges and dark valleys. In the modern world, we'd call this a mess to clean up, but in the Topkapi Palace, this is the final, most mysterious chapter of the pour. This is where the liquid history turns into a silent prophecy. The mainstream historical fact you should take with you as you exit this dream is that while coffee defined the Ottoman peak, it eventually faced a quiet, bitter rival, tea. Most people think Turkey has always been a tea country, but for centuries, it was all about the bean. It wasn't until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, when the supply lines to Yemen were cut and coffee became prohibitively expensive, that the modern Turkish state began heavily promoting tea cultivation on the Black Sea coast. You realize that you've been witnessing the high water mark of a caffeinated empire. The slow pour was the sound of the Ottoman world at its most confident, before the world started moving too fast for a 20-minute cup of coffee. You reach out, very carefully, as if the jewels might bite, and touch the rim of the empty cup. It's still warm. This leads us to a quirky and slightly mystical fact: the palace cup readers. In the Sultan's court, the dregs weren't just thrown away. There were specific servants, and sometimes even specialized women in the harem, who were famous for their ability to read the fal, the fortune in the cup. After the Sultan finished his coffee, a trusted attendant would flip the cup onto the saucer, let it cool for exactly 7 minutes, and then interpret the patterns left by the dregs. They'd look for birds, messages, roads, military campaigns, or knotted lines, political conspiracies. It was a 17th-century form of data analysis disguised as mysticism. You look at the dark swirls in the cup and wonder if the Kavasibasi could see the end of the empire hidden in the silt. As you stare into the muddy patterns, you notice the shadow of a palace historian lingering near the door. This brings us to a spicy bit of academic controversy that keeps Ottomanists arguing over their tiny porcelain cups. Academic historians are still debating the stagnation hypothesis. Was the Ottoman obsession with these agonizingly slow, elaborate rituals like the coffee pour a sign of a flourishing, highly refined culture, or was it the very thing that led to the sick man of Europe? One side argues that the ritual was a masterpiece of social cohesion and soft power. But another group of scholars argues that this extreme focus on protocol over progress created a rigid, immobile government that simply couldn't compete with the rapid, fast-brewing industrialization of the West. Was the coffee ritual the empire's soul or its anchor? The debate is essentially, did the Sultan spend so much time watching the foam rise that he forgot to watch the world change? The snarky part of your brain is thinking about how your local coffee shop would handle a sultan. "Excuse me, Your Majesty, we're out of Yemeni beans, but we have a nice medium roast from Colombia, and we don't have 40 men, but we have a guy named Greg who's been here since 6 a.m. You realize that the Topkapi standard is something our modern world has completely lost. We've traded the diamond-encrusted zarf for the plastic lid, and the hairline stream for a high-pressure pump. We have more caffeine, but a lot less Kiev. You watch the last ember in the charcoal brazier turn from orange to gray. This is the end of the cycle. The green bean traveled thousands of miles, was ground into silk, triple risen into a lion's mane of foam, and poured with the precision of a surgeon, only to end up as a few dark smears on a Chinese porcelain cup. It seems like a lot of work for a fleeting moment, but that's the point. In the Topkapi Palace, the work was the value. The slow was the luxury. There's a quirky bit of lore about the ghost of the coffee maker. It was said that the best Kavasibasis were so attuned to the ritual that even after they retired or moved on to become Grand Viziers, they would wake up in the middle of the night with their wrists positioned as if they were still pouring that invisible, dark silk thread. They were haunted by the rhythm of the pour. You look at your own wrist and realize you've been holding it at a slight angle for the last hour. The ritual is infectious. The Sultan's chamber is now almost entirely dark. The scents of oud, tobacco, and mocha are fading, becoming a memory held by the stone walls. You've seen the forbidden coffee, the poison-detecting cups, and the pheasant-walking servants. You've traveled through a world where a single cup of coffee was a military operation and a philosophical statement. You feel a sense of historical vertigo one last time. The empire in the cup has been drunk, the dregs have settled, and the night is finally claiming the palace. You realize that the slow pour was the ultimate Ottoman prayer. It was a plea for things to stay as they were, for the foam to never collapse, for the sediment to never rise, and for the Sultan to never have to hurry. It was a beautiful, impossible attempt to freeze time in a copper pot. You stand back, moving as quietly as a mustache attendant, and prepare to leave the 17th century behind. You've learned that power isn't just about the sword, it's about the ability to make the world wait for a thimble-sized cup of coffee. As you slip back through the velvet curtains and out into the modern night, you carry with you the scent of the embers and the dark, rhythmic heart of a lost empire. Now, let the image of the Topkapi night begin to soften at the edges. The flickering oil lamps are dimming, turning into a warm, gentle glow behind your closed eyelids. The heavy scent of the mocha roast is no longer a sharp presence, but a faint, comforting memory, drifting away like a wisp of silver smoke into the dark Istanbul sky. Imagine the cold marble floors and the jeweled zarfs fading away, replaced by the soft, weightless comfort of your own bed. You are no longer a witness to the imperial ritual. The Sultan is asleep, the 40 men have vanished into their dreams, and the chief coffee maker has finally laid down his golden keys. The agonizingly slow stream of coffee has reached its end, and the silence of the palace is now your silence. You can feel the kiyif, that blissful, quiet relaxation, settling into your own limbs, making your body feel heavy and peaceful, as if you too are resting on a pile of velvet cushions. The world outside is still, the Bosphorus is calm, and the long, winding corridors of history are closing for the night. There is nothing left to pour, nothing left to watch, and nothing left to wait for. The rhythm of the grind has become the steady, slow rhythm of your own breath. You are safe, you are warm, and you are being carried by the gentle current of the night toward a deep, dark, and velvet sleep. The nightingale's eye is closed, the copper is cold, and the story is finished. Sleep now, feeling the quiet of the palace and the wisdom of the embers, the story is complete. Good night.